Okay, welcome everyone to the 2026 Festival of Ideas. We are in session two now. For all of you who haven't been here yet and you missed the first session, if you're interested in catching up on what you missed, the recording of the first session will be posted at the end of the day online in the festival portal, so you will be able to see it then. We are now in session two, as I said, and we have three speakers lined up for you who will speak one after the other. At the end of each talk, you'll be able to ask each of the speakers questions. So that is Liana Gabora, John Jarrow, and David Cropley. Helping us around this time around is Aaron Meskin, who's the head of the department of the philosophy department, and Eliana Gelman, who is a newly graduated student from the Institute of AI, who's worked closely with us. They'll be moderating the Q&A as well as the panel discussion at the end. Yeah. So I'm going to start by spotlighting Dr. Liana Gabora for us, and she will start sharing screens. And while she is sharing her screen, I will just do her little introduction. So for those of you who don't know her, Professor Liana Gabora is a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of British Columbia in Canada. She's a highly cited interdisciplinary cognitive scientist whose research focuses on how culture evolves. So the different ways in which evolutionary processes work and how creative processes specifically work and how it fuels the evolution of culture. So she brings it all around in a circle. She's also something of a polymath. She composes music and has written several fictional works. Like I said, she's a prolific scholar in creativity. The ones I want to highlight here for why we thought she'd be brilliant for this conference is some of her recent work that looks at AI interactive platforms for visualizing psychological states and processes. This was published in Leonardo in 2025. She's also written on the interaction between art and the artificial in the Journal of Creativity, where she sort of hypothesizes that AI facilitated reflective image development fosters a kind of anticipatory aesthetics in creative interactivity. She also brings up the concept of AI mediated perspectival affordance, which is also super interesting. And she has a current paper I think it's still a preprint with Joscha Bach on building artificial intelligence with creative agency. So she's going to talk to us today about creative thinking in humans and machines, how they are similar and how they differ. So thank you so much, Leanne.
Thank you, Anna. I'm so thrilled to be here for the Torrance Festival. All right, so as Anna was saying, my research focuses on three interrelated open questions. So first, how do the creative processes that fuel cultural change work? Second, how did we acquire the capacity for cumulative creativity? And third, culture exhibits cumulative adaptive change, but what kind of formal framework could we use to describe its evolution? Does it evolve in the same way that organisms evolve or in some other way? And
Leanne, sorry, one second. Are you sharing slides? Because we can't see them. Can people see them? Yes? Oh, okay. Everybody else can. Sorry. Oh.
okay. And this talk, it addresses an issue that really is at the heart of all three of these problems. So how is it is possible that we can develop a coherent self-organizing world model or worldview that both constrains and enables learning behavior and creativity? And this question actually has significant implications for both human and AI creativity. So just to outline what we're going to do, we're going to talk about creativity as iterative transformation of an unfolding mental or latent, in the case of AI, representation by considering it from multiple perspectives. And in humans, these transformations are guided by a pressure to resolve tension, or what is sometimes called a gap in the world model, so as to increase internal coherence. And creativity can foster self-organized emergence and consolidation of a renewed world model and a renewed sense of self that alters future thought and action, and from which flows a personal style. And then we're going to talk about a formal framework of autocatalytic networks, which provides a beautiful way of modeling all this. And I'm going to talk about some preliminary results of endowing AI systems with autocatalytic world model driven to detect and minimize incoherence. So that's to give you a flavor of the journey we're going to go on here. So many of you will probably be familiar with conventional characterizations of divergent and convergent thought. So creativity is generally equated with the capacity for divergent thought, which is defined and measured in terms of the ability to generate multiple solutions. And it's assessed with divergent thinking tasks, such as the alternative uses test, which asks people to, for example, think of as many uses as you can for some kind of common object, such as a brick. And convergent thought is defined and measured in terms of performance on tasks that have just one correct solution. This is how they've been defined and thought of for the last 75 years or so. But there are significant problems with these conventional characterizations of divergent and convergent thought. So not all problems with multiple solutions require creative thought. So if I ask you, what is something red? You might say a fire engine, you might say a stop sign, and that is not particularly creative. Now, if you said a book, because it is red, R-E-A-D, that would be creative, but most answers are not of that sort. And conversely, some problems with a single solution do require creative thought. So for example, the remote associates test. If I give you these three words, tank, hill, and secret, what would be a word that unites all three? And the answer is top. And for that, you have to think about top in many different contexts, in many different ways, and that requires creativity. So people get around this problem by saying that the remote associates test is a test of convergent thought, and creative problem solving involves both divergent and convergent thought, where often they talk about the first phase as having some kind of random element and the second phase as being evaluative. But I don't think the first phase is random, and I don't think the evaluation is limited to just the second phase. I think it would make no sense at all to get halfway through a creative problem solving without doing some kind of evaluation. I view evaluation as the flip side of any single step of the creative process. So given how divergent and convergent thought are conventionally defined in terms of one solution versus many, it actually doesn't make sense to say that creative tasks require both kinds of thought. But you hear people say this all the time. Obviously, a problem can't have both one solution and many solutions. So there's something out of sync with how we are informally talking about creativity and how the formal definition of it that we accept. Moreover, firsthand accounts emphasize not the generation of multiple distinct and separate ideas, like when you are performing the alternative uses task, but the definement and refinement of one particular idea. And even when multiple outputs are generated, they may be accurately conceived of as projections of the same idea rather than distinct and separate ideas. And so what the heck do I mean by projections of the same idea? I mean something quite concrete. So this view of divergent and convergent thought, it grew out of some work that I did on concept interactions. So concept interactions at the very core, they're the heart of creativity, but concepts actually interact in very non-compositional ways. And just to give you some examples of this, people give talks as a trait of pet bird, but they don't give talks as a trait of pets or as a trait of birds. As another example, people never give guppy as an instance of a typical pet or as an instance of a typical fish, but if you ask them for a typical instance of a pet fish, they will always say guppy. So what kind of formal mathematical model of concepts and how they could interact can accommodate the weird behavior with which we actually use concepts? And this led myself and my PhD supervisor, Deirdre Gartz, to develop what has been called a quantum cognition approach to modeling conceptual interactions. So these non-compositional interactions can be described in terms of entanglement and interference effects. And so the unobserved concept is viewed as a superposition of its possible interpretations. And the context is viewed as a measurement. So it induces a collapse to a state of a concept, which is modeled as projection into a new subspace. And I'll give you an example of this in just a second. I know it seems rather abstract, but the key idea is that what we experience is not the underlying concept or idea itself, but a context-driven projection of it into awareness. And there is now extensive theoretical development and empirical support for what at first seemed a kind of crazy idea of using this mathematics that was first developed in one field and first applied 100 years ago to another domain in which this problems with the same kind of flavor were appearing in psychology. And so we're just applying the mathematics in the same way that pretty much every branch of mathematics, it first was applied for application in one problem, and then it was generalized and it was realized that it can actually be applied in many different areas as well. So here is an example. So here we have a vector that represents the prototype of your concept of house. And it is described as a superposition of the states of house that it might eventually collapse to. And so, for example, so it's a state of potentiality. And so in the default context, which is shown in red, so you call this thing ket P, it collapses to the projection vector ket W, so which is the default house. And default house does not have the property of being edible. And we know that because the distance from the origin to A1 is greater than the distance from the origin to A0. So subspace A1 is greater than subspace A0. And now we have house in the context of gingerbread, and that's represented by ket P sub E, and that's shown in blue. And here it collapses to the orthogonal projection vector ket U sub E, i.e. gingerbread house, which is edible, and that shows that now if you look, B sub 0 is actually greater than B sub 1. And so the key message here is that you can have multiple instantiations of the concept house, and they are actually both context-specific projections of house. Log cabin, gingerbread house, and default house, they're not different things in your mind, they're different projections of this concept house. All right, so similarly, sketches for a painting or prototypes of an invention can be viewed as consecutive projections of the underlying idea in different contexts or perspectives. So for any concept, there exists some context that actualizes even seemingly unthinkable properties of it, such as a house being edible. And this formalism allows us to model this, and creativity relies on that. It relies on the fact that for any concept, even the most seemingly unthinkable property can be, in some context, relevant to that concept. So the implication then is that what we experience is not the underlying concept or idea itself, but a context-driven projection of it into awareness. And for people who are familiar with this concept of Plato's allegory of the cave, that has some familiarity. So the key message then is that each thought step alters not just your conception of the idea, so the actualization of potential, but this zone of potentiality for the next conception. Thus, reiterated honing extricates a possibility that could not have been conceived of initially. All right, so all this suggests a new way of thinking about and characterizing divergent and convergent thought. It suggests that convergent thought is where the subject of thought, what you're thinking about, your mental contents, are held in a very compact form, just the most defining features. And this invites conventional perspectives, and so your intention is able to go towards mental operations on that thought. So something like multiplication or combination. And divergent thought is when the subjective thought is held in a looser form that includes contextually elicited features. And that is conducive to unconventional perspectives. It evokes what are called remote associates, ideas that are seemingly far apart, but in one particular context, they actually become close together and relevant to each other. And that's conducive to some kind of novel but ill-defined synthesis that will require reiterated projection through honing to work it through and figure it out. And so this is compatible with the fact that not all problems with multiple solutions require creative thought, and conversely, some problems with a single creative solution do require creative thought. So with, for example, the fact that for the remote associates test, we need one solution, yet it does require multiple perspectives to actually get the right answer. For example, in that top example that we saw earlier. And then I use the term contextual focus to refer to the capacity to shift between these two modes of thought, to shift between convergent thought when you're on a roll, when it's just a matter of going through some kind of rote process, and divergent thought when you're stuck in a rut, when you need to think about things in some kind of new way. For example, if the environment changes. And what are some of the implications of this view of divergent and convergent thought? Well, divergent thought is now conceived of as not many single-step processes, but one multi-step process. So most creative tasks don't require multiple solutions. They require one solution that entails multiple thought steps. And these thought steps are recursive. So the outcome of one step provides the seed for the next step. And together, they cumulatively restructure the conception of the unborn idea, and they're preferred or offered by the creator's uniquely structured world model, which in turn, the creative world model is altered by this creative process. And it's because of this that our world models, our mental understandings of who we are in relation to the world and what the relation holds for us, that process can be therapeutic. It's because our world model is changing through the creative process. Okay, the second implication for this redefinition of divergent convergent thought has to do with the role of evaluation. So convergent thought is often described as the evaluative phase, but it wouldn't make sense, as I said earlier, to get midway through a creative process with no evaluation whatsoever. So in my view, each thought step proceeds based on evaluation of the prior thought step. Thus, evaluation is present throughout the creative process and more noticeable in the convergent stage as a creator brings to bear perspectives that would simulate the criticisms the idea may be subjected to when it gets scrutinized by other people. And the third implication has to do with divergent thinking tests. Since in the alternative uses test, after each thought step, for example, generating one use for a brick, you return to the same starting point, the task of generating another use for a brick, you're never more than one thought step away from socially sanctioned norms and beliefs. But first-hand accounts suggest that creators venture many thought steps away from consensus reality to become immersed in a world of their own making. So the alternative uses test may test for an ability that is correlated with creativity, the capacity to generate multiple one-step responses, as opposed to testing for creativity itself. And so as a illustrative metaphor, this is an ambiguous wood cutting with light shining from three different directions, yielding three different shadows, a G and an E and a B. And note that the top triplet is not just a rotated version of the one below, but it's a different shape, yet they yield the same three shadows. So now I want you to imagine that the wood cuttings were hidden and we came to understand their shapes by the shadows they cast. And so you might cast one beam from one direction and it would yield one shadow, and another beam from another direction and it would yield another shadow. But in fact, since the upper and lower wood cuttings have different shapes, then to distinguish them, we would have to shine shadows from more different angles, casting shadows that don't look like any actual letters. And similarly, we may know ideas by the residues they leave when reflected upon from different perspectives. So the more complex the wood cutting, the more angles needed, and similarly, the more complex your ideas, the more honing steps that are needed. And in fact, there's one shape that no matter what direction you shine light from, it will yield the same shadow. And that's the shape of a sphere. Whatever direction the light comes from, the shadow is just a circle. But so that would correspond to the alternative uses test, where you're just coming up with an answer and it only takes you one step to get there. But I believe that most creative ideas take more than one step. And so they're more like this illustrative metaphor here. All right, so in this analogy, divergent thought, you're applying unconventional context. It's like shining light from different directions, and the shadows appear as different letters. And convergent thought is like applying conventional context. It's like shining light from similar angles. So the shadows appear as distorted versions of the same letter. So for example, an E with a wobble in it. All right, so now we put this theory to the test. Does creativity, thus conceived, generate good ideas? And this was tested using EVOC, which is a computer model of cultural evolution, and it's an artificial society of neural network-based agents. Each iteration, each agent either invents a new action or imitates a neighbor. And so what we do is we can observe the effect of variables on the fitness and diversity of different ideas produced by the different agents. And I don't have time to go into it, but I gave the agents in this model a form chaining, which is a form of this reiterative restructuring process. And then I also gave them the capacity for contextual focus, this ability to shift between divergent and convergent modes of thought. And the results are that chaining increased the fitness of the ideas and the diversity of ideas. And it also increased, so the fitness on the left and diversity on the right. And you can see on the left that it also increased the ability to learn trends. So with learning added, the benefits of having chaining became much more profound. There was no limit, no ceiling on the possible fitness of ideas. And when we gave the agents contextual focus, that further increased the fitness and diversity of their ideas. And this was particularly true when there was an environmental change, which is interesting because that's exactly what we were hoping for, because divergent thought is most valuable when you need to think about things in a radically new way. So this supports the theory that divergent thought entails not just generating many single-step ideas, but multi-step reiterative honing of an idea from different perspectives in different modes of thought. Okay, on to the second section of the talk. What guides this reiterative restructuring and contextual focus? So there's a common notion that creativity arises from recognizing or constructing a problem or a gap. But that just leaves us with the question, a gap in what? And for some years now, my students and I have been working on the honing theory of creativity. And that's the idea that it's a gap in a self-organizing world model that doesn't just update beliefs or priors to fit observations, so what we call world tracking, but it envisions and explores new realms of possibility, what we call world shaping, the kind of thing that if a writer is writing a novel, they are constructing a whole new world. That is something that you cannot get to by just updating priors. So it continuously and autonomously from within monitors and detects incoherence, things that aren't jiving, things that don't fit together. And it increases coherence by spontaneously reorganizing knowledge and generating new knowledge, where coherence reflects not just the accuracy of the world model, but also the internal consistency between elements of the world model and existing versus desired or imagined or potential things that the world might hold. And coherence isn't imposed from the outside, it emerges from interactions within the world model itself. So let's now look at a few of the studies that test the predictions of this theory. So the first study looked at the recognizability of style within and across domains. So honing theory predicts that since it posits that creativity reflects not just chance or expertise, but the transformative process by which a creative resolves the potentiality of their world model, it predicts that the creator's style or voice may be recognizable not just within a domain, but even across domains. So we carried out a number of studies. In one study, students in a painting class identified significantly above chance which of their classmates created which painting, so that's within domain, and which non-painting artwork, so that was a test of cross-domain. And in another study, creative writing students identified significantly above chance which classmate created which written passage, which would be studying their within domain recognizability of their creative style, but also which work of art. So they only knew each other's writing styles. They'd never seen each other's work before, but they knew the writing style of that classmate. And so the question here is, could something about their inner self, their inner worldview, be reflected not just in their writing, but also in their art to the extent that people would recognize their style? And the results were significantly significant for the within domain studies at the 0.05 level for all groups, as well as for the pooled data. And for the cross-domain studies, for all groups except groups 2 and 4 in the first study, as well as for the pooled data. So the takeaway then is that the recognizability of creative style really exists, even across domains, and this is consistent with what a coherence-seeking architecture would do, such as, we say, the human mind. Okay, looking at another study, this is just a little sprinkling of a couple of a vast number of studies that we've been doing over the last 20 years in my lab. So this one looks at coherence seeking in cross-domain inspiration. So some research, such as findings that people rarely achieve greatness in multiple domains, suggests that creative achievement is domain-specific. But other research, such as evidence of a creative personality type and evidence that hobbies stimulate creativity, give indirect evidence that creativity is actually domain general. And so we take a new approach to the issue. So most creativity research focuses on creative outputs, the products of creative thinking. But by examining the inspirational inputs to creativity, we can see whether the inputs are from the same domain as the outputs. So honing theory has the view that creativity is how a coherence-seeking architecture restructures itself to better integrate its context. And this predicts that the mind can use any incompletely resolved material it has at its disposal. Thus, the influences from domains other than that of the final product are expected to impact the creative process. And so we had participants in one study involved creative experts and another undergraduates from diverse academic backgrounds. We just had them list the creative outputs that they could remember doing in their lives, and then the inspirational sources. So what inspired each of these creative outputs that were associated with each one? And this shows on the right examples of outputs that we found for each category. So for example, for painting, within domain narrow, an example would be another painting. Within domain broad, an example would be that we got was spirograph. Cross-domain was global warming, and then we also had a uncertain category, and that would be knowledge was an example of that. And we found that cross-domain influences were even more frequent than within-domain influences, and whether they were narrow or broad. And we would have been happy just finding that cross-domain influences existed at all, but finding out that they were much more frequent than within-domain both broad and narrow added together was very strong support for this idea that the mind does use diverse, incompletely resolved contents to create in order to achieve and expand global internal coherence. All right, so now we're going to talk about some of the implications of this for cognition and artificial intelligence. So, a growing body of research suggests that creative cognitive architectures, such as the human mind, continually monitor, detect, and respond to inconsistencies by spontaneously reorganizing knowledge and generating new knowledge so as to weave a more coherent world model. Well, coherence isn't just between the world model and the world, but also between elements of the world model and existing world versus the actual or desired or imagined world. And so the implication is that creative cognition should be modeled as a self-organizing network capable of open-ended restructuring. And I propose that the formal framework of autocatalytic networks is up to the task of modeling this. So autocatalytic networks are networks for which, through interactions amongst the parts, we get a phase transition to where they form an integrated whole. So say you have just a bunch of nodes, like we have these colorful dots here, then as the ratio of edges to nodes increases, where the edges are just connections between these nodes, we get an increase in the size of the largest cluster. But there's a point at which this happens very quickly, and that's called the percolation threshold. And so where we go from a fragmented and incoherent network to a integrated and coherent network. And so autocatalytic networks are an abstract formal framework used to model systems that exhibit autonomous, emergent, self-organization, self-maintenance, and regenerative growth. And they can model cumulative adaptive, low fidelity replication and evolution. And there's two domains of application. So the first domain is chemical reaction systems to model the origin and early evolution of life, and cognitive systems to model the origin and evolution of minds that are capable of cumulative cultural change. And Mike Steele and I have written a paper published in Proceedings of the Royal Society Interface, suggesting that it's no coincidence that at the heart of these two evolutionary processes that we know about, biological and cultural, you have something that can be described as an autocatalytic network, an early protocell in the case of the origin of life, and a mind in the case of the origin of culture. So there have been many cognitive applications of this. So a first is the transition culminating in the origin of the kind of cognitive network capable of evolving culture. The developmental transition culminating in the capacity to be a creative participant in cultural evolution. It's been applied to modeling creative thought, psychotherapeutic interactions between a therapist and a client, cultural lineages and discontinuities, being able to use to model agency in artificial intelligence. So the idea then is that humans possess two levels of adaptive, self-organizing, self-mending structure. So in addition to an organismal level, our bodies, we also have a psychological level, our minds. And these, a mathematical development of autocatalytic networks is something called RAF networks, developed by Mike Steele and his colleagues, that distinguish between what he calls food set items, which are the raw materials available to the system. So in cognitive applications, these include like innate knowledge or ideas that you might attain from others through social learning or even through individual learning. And then food set derived items, which are internally generated by the system. And so this would be a new idea. So the new idea that comes to you in your own mind, you didn't get it from the outside world, you generated it yourself, that's a food set derived item. And then mental operations are referred to as cognitive reactions. Food set derived items are products of cognitive reactions. Mental contents that take part in cognitive reactions are referred to as reactants, and the cognitive catalyst is whatever triggers a reaction that is not by itself altered by the reaction. So as an example, the smell of pie triggers a poem. Well, the smell of pie is serving as a cognitive catalyst in this example. All right, so this is just the formal definition of a RAF network. It's a network wherein there's at least one cognitive reaction resulting in a product, and all reactants and catalysts needed for each cognitive reaction are present. They could either be part of the food set items, or they can be made from earlier food set derived reactions. And a max RAF is just the largest RAF in the set, and it can be composed of sub RAFs And then creativity is viewed as the reiterated honing process whereby a world model self-organizes to grow and maintain a max-RAF by increasing the coherence amongst sub-RAFs. And I think this will become a little bit clearer with some examples. So panels A through E depict a transition from no RAF to one RAF. So on the far left, you see just sort of some ideas that in this case are innate ideas. New knowledge comes in from the outside. And then something catalyzes the first new idea. And so that new idea, the first idea that this individual has on their own is that little black, represented by that little black dot. And then this formalism can be used to describe how our minds grow and we add new structure as these new reactions occur and new catalysts occur and the structure builds and grows. And as you can see by the fact that even in panel I, there are two elements, the green one on the top left and the white one on the bottom right, that are not part of that max RAF. So they would represent things like dreams that you cannot remember on your own. Now, something later in the day might remind you of that dream, but they're not part of that network. So you have no way of getting through any string of associations to that idea. Or it could be something like something that you experience in a drug state that is so far from reality as you know it that you can't voluntarily access it. And creativity is viewed, so as connections accumulate, the system crosses a threshold to becoming self-sustaining. And we posit that that can model what happens at around the age of 3 or 4 years old when a child sort of develops this first idea that they have their own way of looking at things. They're not just a stimulus response machine. They don't just do the right thing at the right time. They can sort of adapt an existing idea to some slightly different situation or combine two elements. And then creativity is the process by which a world model moves towards such closure. Okay, this diagram, I'm not going to go over in detail, but just the idea is that the one on the left and the one on the right, they have the same knowledge, they have all the same pieces of information, but the one on the left can think about this knowledge more creatively, and the RAF framework provides a way of modeling that. And then I wanted to show you an example of how you can use this to depict creativity that extends across individuals. So we're thinking about someone named George de Mestral who had the problem of how to make fabric pieces stick and unstick. And that is represented in his cognitive network. And then he realized that burdock seed can actually, which sticks to clothing, it catalyzed the invention of Velcro. And that's how this cognitive reaction is represented here. And then that blue circle represents the RAF structure. And NASA needed a way to stop things from floating in space, and Puma needed a runner that's easy to put on and take off. And similarly, we can show how Velcro catalyzed cognitive reactions in their minds, leading to their new inventions. And then we can note that Velcro is a food set derived item in George de Mestral's mind, since he's the one that thought of it, but it actually is a food site item. It's a raw material for NASA and Puma because they didn't think of it. And then this shows the RAFs connecting. So Velcro inspired the hook and loop strip for NASA and inspired the shoelaceless runners for Puma. And so we can also show the RAFs connecting these structures, and then we can also show the RAF that connects them all. All right. So I do want to just run through some of the applications of this to AI. So AI is creative. So some outputs are deemed more creative than others. And AI actually approximates this chaining or reiterative restructuring that we were talking about earlier, because the modification of a state vector that encodes the latent meaning of a forthcoming response is changing. It's being reiterated, considered in different contexts as the LLM goes through the processing needed to respond to your prompt. It also approximates contextual focus, so it responds convergently when prompted with technical or literal questions. And so, for example, if it's asked something in plain English to explain a scientific term, but it also can respond more divergently when prompted with open-ended, metaphorical, playful, or poetic instructions, such as if you ask it to write a satire. But unlike humans, AI doesn't autonomously detect and respond to incoherence. This is because the principal task of AI is not to mend and extend a world model, but to make it internally consistent. But prediction error minimization, so reducing the mismatch between expectation and an observation, what we've called world tracking. And so in humans, a songwriter might express the pain of a breakup through music, and memory fragments would be reshaped into a song, and then a new perspective emerges. And afterwards, they come to terms with the breakup. They understand it differently. So their world model is restructured in a way that increases its coherence. And you might also have solidification of the person's core identity or of their creative style. And new possibilities become reachable because they've thought things through in a new way. So creativity can reorganize your world model and your sense of self, but this is not the case for AI. So if it's prompted, for example, to write a song about a breakup that turns loss into growth, it might produce a decently good song. However, generating the song does not open up new possibility spaces or restructure internal organization, and subsequent outputs are not shaped by this transformation. So there's no cumulative shift in style or in their world model. And that's because AI produces creative artifacts, but it is not transformed by engaging in that creative process. And that's because there's no self there to be transformed. So I'm not going
Um,
to run through
yeah,
this.
Leanna, we're down to the last 3 minutes of yours if you want a
Okay.
Q&A. Yeah.
Okay. So key message is coherence seeking is complementary to prediction error minimization, also something else, Bayesian learning. And both we posit are required for multi-step iterative creativity. So for setting out an inner world realm of one's own making. All right. So I'm not going to go into all the details of how we can map the RAF framework onto AI transformers, such as large language models, but take my word for it, we can do that, and we have done that. And and transformers actually they do engage in some of this coherence seeking behavior. But I won't go over this because what I want to do is show just some preliminary results that I've obtained with my colleague Armando Vieira, comparing the prediction error minimization, which is the typical structure of AI, and a RAF architecture. So we used a simple world, and basically what I want you to notice there is that on the right, the fact that the on the right, but to the left of it, we have the prediction error minimization agent, and on the right side of this, we have the RAF agent. And notice that the space of possibilities that is achieved by the RAF agent is much, much larger. And this is also some preliminary work showing that we also have the RAF network has a much higher generative capacity with no decrease in predictive accuracy. All right, so summary. The view of creativity as coherent seeking, iterative honing of a unfolding mental representation. And this grew out of this work on taking a quantum cognition approach to modeling how concepts interact and combine. And this suggests a redefinition of divergent convergent thought, and it's also consistent with what goes on in generative artificial intelligence. So we use RAF networks because they can enable us to model step by step the creative process by which incoherence, or this gap in the world model, is reduced, and how one creative idea begets another. And that allows us to get cumulative cultural evolution. And we saw that creativity can foster the self-organized emergence and consolidation of our new world model and sense of self. that alters future thought and action, and from which flows a personal and creative style. And we have some preliminary evidence that AI systems with RAF networks that detect and minimize incoherence, leading to conceptual integration and a world model expansion and more extensive exploration of the space of possibilities. And that is it. Thanks for listening to this rather quickly generated talk. And I have a book coming out on all this, which is called Dawn of the Creative Mind, The Origin and Evolution of Culture and Innovation, published by Cambridge University Press in November. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Gabora. We don't have time for questions now because the next session starts right at 1:45, but there is a discussion at the end of the three talks. So many questions and comments, but we'll have to save them for later. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, if you have questions, keep them for the panel discussion. You can put them in the chat window so you don't forget it. And I'm going to introduce our second speaker, John, who is up very early in the morning to do this. I really appreciate it. John, you can try and see if you can share your presentation or whatever while I'm introducing you. Should be able to. So Professor John Garrow is a research professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Drexel University in Pennsylvania. He has been a visiting professor of architecture, artificial intelligence, civil engineering, cognitive science, computer science, design and computation, or mechanical energy engineering at a bunch of different institutions, including MIT, Berkeley, UCLA, Columbia, Carnegie Mellon, and many others in the US, and at Strathclyde and Loughborough in the UK, at INSA and Provence in France, and at EPFL in Switzerland. He is an incredibly prolific and highly cited scholar with over 33,000 citations to his name. He's published over 900 articles, including 57 authored or edited books, as well as numerous conference presentations on design neurocognition, design cognition, artificial intelligence in design and in design theory. Professor Garrow uses computational methods, cognitive methods, and cognitive neuroscientific methods, as well as brain imaging using EEG, functional NIRS, and functional MRI to study design thinking and creative thinking. So he's going to talk about something super exciting now, which is his talk title is Your Mind and Brain on Gen AI. Thank you so much, John. You are muted.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate you all getting up during the day, but 3 a.m. is quite early for me. All right. What I want to do is cover a span of ideas, all of which are connected to AI, computation, cognition, and neurocognition. The first thing is, it comes as a surprise to some people that generative AI was not invented in November 2022 with ChatGPT. It actually started very much earlier, and I'm talking of decades earlier. So here is some work that is a generative AI system that Rob Saunders and I developed that does self-learning. It uses one simple idea, which is we look for regularities in the world around us. And it uses reinforcement learning to learn what these regularities might be. So just very quickly in this one panel, on the left, we have drawn two overlapping squares. That's what we have produced. What it looks for is, firstly, how is this represented? And this is represented just as pixels on a screen. It has no structured representation behind it. So what you see is what you get, but what you see is what you decide to see. So it looks at this, and I'll just very quickly go through how it might find things. Every pixel has an X and Y coordinate. It scans this space of filled and unfilled coordinates and finds a regularity. A regularity is, it sees that all X's are the same and Y varies by 1 unit. Well, that's a vertical line for us. And it finds the other regularity, which is Y is fixed and X varies by 1 unit. That's a horizontal line. Each of these it calls a concept, which it categorizes, and now it's got 2 concepts. Using those 2 concepts, it searches for vertical and horizontal lines. It finds them, and I use the word discover loosely. It discovers that these intersect at a common point, and now we have not just an edge, but a vertex. And so it goes on, and it finds things like, as it builds up spaces which are bounded by lines and vertices, it finds emergent spaces like the upside down L. So this is a self-learning system from about 30 years ago. Then we took the idea that life is based on genetics. Can we express our world in the form of genetics, which means separating out the representation of the thing from the thing itself? And that's what genetics does. We start off with DNA, which is at the base level, and we express that as an organism, which is the thing we're interested in. And the organism lives in a world where it has a fitness, which it doesn't necessarily need to know about, but that fitness controls how it progresses into the next generation. So we can take this idea, and here's a set of 10 designs, which are just squares laid out. And we have tagged these designs as good or bad or neutral. That's all we've said. And then we use machine learning, to find something about the genetic structure, and the numbers below it represent the sequence of the genes that are applied to generate this layout. And this is a different sequence. And what it looks for is some common structure in the good designs that are not in the bad designs. And what it finds is that there is a common structure, 285, which is not in the others. And it turns out it looks like this. We didn't tell it to look for holes, but it found holes. And now you can apply this. So here's some paintings by the Dutch artist Mondrian. And here are some of the genes that we've learned expressed in painting. So, and now we can apply this in whatever way we want. So the left-hand side is a fairly crude, genetically engineered Mondrian. And now we can do Rubik cubes in Mondrians, which one couldn't have imagined doing before. So I want to just very quickly go through what happens when you apply the idea of situated cognition. Very quickly, situated cognition moves you from cognitive structures are what we claim are happening in the mind, to how these cognitive structures are actually a consequence of interactions between ideas, between people, and between the world that people inhabit. And you can look at those words. So I want to apply those kinds of ideas. That is, cognition is a function of interaction, and build an AI system based on those. And I'm going to exemplify it by looking at how styles form. So we have design agents. Agents are autonomous computer programs. All of them generate artworks. They happen to use a genetic method for doing that. They talk to each other, but they talk to each other by sending each other their artworks and then deciding whether they're interesting or not. And then they're rewarding the other agent if the artworks are interesting. And interesting comes about from looking at novelty, utility, and surprise in relation to their own world. Whoops. And this is what an agent looks like. Let's not get too involved in it. It's an evolutionary system that does short-term and long-term learning. And let's not, as I said, let's not worry too much about the internals. We define novelty and surprise. Surprise is the most important one, which is the failure of confident expectations. You'll notice surprise and novelty are not directly related at all. I think any creative system that does not include surprise does not capture sufficient of what the idea of creativity deals with. Something's motivation is driven by curiosity, and there's a computational model of curiosity, and interest is driven by Wundt's 19th century idea. This is Wundt's hedonic function. It says that the response you get is a reward and punishment a combination, and that gives you a unique shape and gives you a place where you get better responses than others. So here's the genetic art. This is actually just something we pulled off the web. Here's what happens when you have not different novelty functions. And what's interesting here is that if you don't use this kind of novelty function, nothing much happens. And if the novelty function is too far away, it becomes random. And in between, it's structured. We took a set of 10 agents, let them run in this world, and what we discovered is they bifurcated into 2 sets where each set has a very similar style. And so now we're able to build a model of how styles emerge. And one can imagine doing lots of other things with this. Now I want to move on to the sort of genetic AI or generative AI we're more familiar with. This is not ChatGPT. This is deep learning of building or proposing drone chassis. The data for this is taking a drone and instrumenting one drone with all the mechanical and structural measurements one can make. And this is just a quick romp through this latent space that is generated from just learning across a single instance. What's interesting, though, is that they all have the same conceptual structure because that's what it learnt from. One single instance. Now I want to show you something that I believe is unique. We have access to what I would call a natural experiment. This is a competition carried out where the people who put the competition together, which is the competition is to take this ruin on a small peninsula in Italy and design something to make it a viable construction. What is interesting about this is that the competition proponents have produced a Gen AI system. It's a bespoke GPT, and you could use it or not. Roughly 600 entries and 200 designers said they would use the AI, and in the end, about 157 used the AI. So what we have is the transcripts of 157 designers, not in a lab, not in a place where they have no skin in the game. Here, the first prize is 100,000 euros and the possibility they might build it, which for a designer is enormously attractive. So the motivation is real. And we have the iterative use of this Gen AI for 157 designers. Some of them used it across 2 or 3 iterations, some dozens. And I just want to show you a couple of results. And these are quite different to lab experiments. The results here, we're measuring something like divergence and something like creativity or a component of it by measuring semantic distance. How far away are the ideas from where you started? And here the starting point is, if you can think, this is an iterative process. We have a designer, D, and an AI, and they iterate one after the other. We take the semantic distance between each iteration, and each iteration is either a D followed by AI or AI followed by D. And we're measuring the semantic distance in each of those. If an AI behaved in this sense as the same as a human, and by the way, human teams are in general symmetric across whether it's person A followed by B or B followed by A, they run along that 45-degree line. There's a symmetry in their semantic distance. We can see here that there is an asymmetry between humans and the AI they're using. And interestingly enough, the symmetry is skewed towards designers coming up with ideas that are further from the ideas the AI came up with. The AI came up with many more ideas, but they were less distant. A lot of lab experiments show the opposite. I don't know why. All I know is that this is a natural experiment with a fairly large size. If you plot the sentences uttered by each of these, the designer and the AI, you'll see the AI, who is purple, there's a lot more. And the red is the designer. But look at the distribution. Whoops, look at the distribution of these across semantic space, and you'll see all the distant ones from the centroid of this space, they're all the designer. And if you plot the convex hull of this space, you will find that all vertices bar one are human generated. Okay, let's move on quickly. So you can take the idea of reinforcement learning, which, by the way, is not an AI idea. It comes from Pavlov, and apply it to humans. So it went from early notions from what was the foundations of maybe cognitive science through to AI, and now we want to bring it back. So this is some work on what happens if you apply reinforcement learning not to a neural network, an artificial neural network, but to the human brain and the cognition that comes from that. So what are we doing? We know through brain scans that the prefrontal medial cortex, this part here, is generally most active, and I'm hand waving a little bit here, when you're coming up with ideas. So if we produce a heat map of the activations in the brain, such as the one you see there, and make red the most active, you'll get something that looks like that. And that's actually a real individual's brain. What we do now is in near real time, and we're using functionally infrared spectroscopy, which is just a method for looking inside the brain and looking at activations of regions in the brain. We're going to show each individual their brain activations as they're thinking. And we give them a 4-word instruction. Keep this part red. That's it. And what do we get? So each one of these is one person, right? The control is before we say anything. And this is the distribution of activations in the left and right hemisphere. And this is time. So we look at which hemisphere is dominant. And we can see that, it fluctuates. So this is person one. With neurofeedback, we get a pretty dramatic change in brain behavior. And the effect of this is what it looks like in terms of cognitive load, which is measured by the amount of brain activation. The higher the activation, the higher the cognitive load. So this is the left-hand side is the control. We have a placebo where we show people someone else's activations in case it's looking at it that gives the result. And the answer is yes. And this is the feedback. And we can see just qualitative visual examination that something interesting is happening here. And now, these are the results. Self-reinforcement learning produces twice the number of ideas. This is now, we've done this with hundreds of people. Students, my interest is design, so these are designers from different disciplines. We go to conferences, we take our equipment, we measure people, And this is the result we get, that people work twice as fast when you give them this, and they produce twice the number of ideas. And let me then finish with, we also study the direct effect of using ChatGPT. And here's an experiment where we've divided the task into two. One is thinking about the problem, which is called framing, and coming up with ideas to deal with that problem. And this is our control. This is the heat map of brain activations for these two. And this is an amalgamation of 50 odd people. Then we run it with ChatGPT. And what we see is, and this is all, you can measure, do all these statistics here, but the qualitative appearance gives it to you. There's a dramatic is not a scientific term, a dramatic reduction in cognitive load, and particularly in coming up with ideas. Now, what's the significance of this? Well, clearly, and the flip side of this, by the way, is that you produce more ideas using ChatGPT than unaided, but much, much less cognitive effort. And there's a very large number of experiments that finish here and conclude that the effect of this is that since you don't need to use your brain as much, you will probably slowly reduce brain activity because you will increasingly rely on ChatGPT. Of course, there's another interpretation, is that you now have cognitive surplus. You've got more, you haven't used your capacity. The capability hasn't changed, so now you can do other things. But if you run the experiment differently, you run a second experiment. This is exactly the first part without ChatGPT. This is with ChatGPT thinking about the problem, but now you don't use ChatGPT to come up with ideas. What we're looking for here is, does the use of an AI prime your brain in such a way that you don't need the aid anymore? And look what happens. Without ChatGPT, you get an effect similar to using it. The number of ideas generated drops, but their semantic distance doesn't. So there's clearly something else going on. And I want to leave it there. Obviously, there's a lot more to say. This new tool of ours, generative AI, as I said, has been around for a long time. The big difference is that today it's very accessible because it uses a natural language interface. You can talk to it. And it gives you truly interesting results. But if you go back to Alan Turing, he wrote a paper actually in 1947, but didn't publish it till 1949 on artificial intelligence. And if you read that paper, he said that computers will produce things that we could produce, but if we had enough time and capacity, but we can't, and therefore what they produce will surprise us. And let me finish there.
Thank you so much, Professor. Is it Giro?
Giro.
Giro, sorry. Thank you so much. I'm fascinated by the offloading stuff right at the end. My initial thought is offloading is great. I can get so much more done when I can offload things to my calculator and my laptop and my map software and my computer. So I'm not so worried about offloading. But your last result, the thought was that, can you just go over that last result again and just have us think about it? So without ChatGPT, so just describe this again and just so I'm
Okay. The experiment is this. These are design tasks, for what that's worth. And I mention that because the alternative uses task, which is the backbone in cognitive psychology, is a memory task. It's not a generative task. To me, that's a fundamental flaw, because you're not capturing generation, you're capturing memory. And anyway, that's a little aside to discuss it another time. The experiment has the following. We divide the task into two. The first is framing. This, by the way, every person is given six tasks to 6 prompts. And in each of them, they come up with outline the problem, because the prompts are all single sentence. And then they come up in the second part with ideas on how to deal with this. The left-hand side, without ChatGPT, shows the heat map of brain activations for the two parts of this task. The right-hand one, we change the experiment, so we only use ChatGPT for framing.
Okay, got it.
After framing, you don't use ChatGPT. And the result is surprisingly similar. And again, I'm just using qualitative terms. You can look at these statistics as if you had been using ChatGPT. The implication being that you have somehow or other primed yourself, and there is a flow-on effect. We have a proposal in with the NSF to investigate this. No, NSF's in turmoil, so who knows what will happen. But there's something happening here. Now, of course, we're familiar with the extension of this, which is habituation. After a while, you don't need the prompt to give you the result that you're producing, which, by the way, goes back to Pavlov and his dog. So this is the idea behind it, is not new. What is new is that we're able to measure things associated with thought as opposed to physical reactions.
John, can I ask a question, Aaron?
Yes,
after this?
absolutely. Absolutely. Go ahead, Hannah.
I'm really interested in this, of course, because of course, in some sense, this makes perfect sense, because if you haven't engaged, sort of actively tried to think about the problem yourself, and you're sort of outsourcing the thinking about the problem with something else in a kind of passive way, then the coming up with ideas is less likely to, because you're almost like priming your pathways and relevant. Again, maybe if you give an example, it might be easier for us to sort of get our head around how thinking about the problem can be dissociated from coming up with ideas. But without the prep, then there is no idea. Ideation is then obviously then a little more self-generated ideation is going to be reduced because, in a sense, what I'm wondering if you could speak to the sort of actively engaging in the problem preparation period yourself versus a more passive engagement, which comes with putting in prompts and something being told to you, which is where I would say the conceptual expansion you're sort of coming up with is going to be quite limited. So would you say something about you talked about priming, but what is it about preparation then, or thinking about the problem that sort of greases the wheels for coming up with ideas? Could you
Okay.
speak a little bit to that?
This is a completely artificial situation. I don't mean anything to do with AI. People don't stop thinking about the problem and only come up, they don't say, now I'm thinking about the problem and now I'm thinking about the solution. What happens is people are not rational. We know that in the sense of running through reasoning. I think reasoning is the post facto description of what you think, what you claim you did. But that's a separate discussion. You will find when you study people that very quickly they spend some time thinking about the problem and they very quickly put forward ideas. And then they think about the problem, put forward more ideas, think about it a bit more. And this notion of thinking about the problem runs all the way through. But the problem they're looking at is different, a little bit different every time, because this is a temporal process and the past guides the future. But the past is not a path you're following. The past is only the path that you generated. Otherwise, everyone would be doing the same thing. And the path you generated is a function of your experience and the situation you're in and all of that. So, and then to make it more descriptive, the past changes in your interpretation of it. So the past for you is not fixed. The events may be fixed, but what they mean, John Dewey, couldn't find the reference, but it's quoted in William Clancy's book, this very nice sentence. Current experiences structure and hence give meaning to what was experienced before. And I think that's a profound idea, which we build into our systems. So now coming back to this, the purpose of this experiment was, as is typical in scientific studies, and it's a fundamental failing of the scientific method, which is you isolate the variable and you explore it. And you assume that when you put it back, it's the same. Well, I can show you what happens both in your mind and in your brain if I do intervention A, you get this nice thing. Intervention B, you get this other nice result. And when I do them together, the result bears no relation to what happened because of A or what happened because of B. It's fundamentally different. So superposition, which is one of the foundations of science in many domains, it's not a fundamental idea in science, does not apply in cognition. So all these experiments need to be taken with a grain of salt, including this one, right? But having said that, this tells us something we didn't know. You know, this slide shows you something that wasn't in existence before. That's what we try for, right?
I think it
To
also
find
raises a
things.
question about reinforcement, what you started with, because
Yeah.
we are reinforced to you in using this to as a partner to think about and so on.
Yeah.
In some ways, it is a reinforcement, not a reward.
So one of the things I'm trying to think about more is what's the implication of this kind of result for education? Now, MIT published the word published, they uploaded a paper that's 102 pages long. I don't know who publishes papers that long. Actually, the Journal of Artificial Intelligence, which is a foundational journal, it does publish papers of that length. But their result was that ChatGPT is not used just to offload cognition a bit, it's to take over cognition. There's a difference, right? And they were all experiments of the bounded kind, and they didn't look at any of this kind of thing. And of course, what they found was that if you ask people to use it, let people to use it, you get this continuing depletion of activation until what you're left with is simply controlling the system, the AI, the Gen AI, not what it does. So you offload all of that. And what they found was the more of that you do, the less you're able to do the thing again yourself. Well, maybe that tells us now, one should never change the world based on an experiment with 50 people in one place at one time with a bunch of people who are trying to get somewhere with ideas, but it's a starting point. So I don't think I would change the education system, but what I would do is do more research to say maybe this fantastic tool, and I use the word fantastic in its sort of original meaning, it in fantasy, can be used to make us better, not to make us more efficient, although it'll certainly do that, but to make us better, make us more creative, the purpose of tools depends on who is looking at it. If you're looking at the financial economy of a country, you want your tools to increase your productivity. That is, for the same effort, you get more output. On the other hand, we've seen with the Industrial Revolution how that's devastating for individuals. It does not give them a better life in their heads. So maybe we should think of what's the purpose of all this AI is not for, Sam Altman and Elon Musk and the others to become trillionaires. I don't care if they do or not. I think the purpose should be more human and more humane. That is, to give us a better life. Yes.
We had one really interesting question in the chat from Nicole, I think. So here in the study you have ChatGPT used in thinking about the problem, then without in coming up with the ideas. And she wondered if you've reversed it. and did the thinking
No.
no. Do you have any thoughts about how that might go?
Yes. Let me preface this by saying we've done the first part independently of this. We had an experiment where we just wanted to see what offloading cognition using, a GPT, and we got the result that you see at the top. What we found was that you got many more ideas. I would imagine that's what it would look like if you reversed it. That you would, if you if you flip this diagram, that's sort of what you'd get.
I was just going to suggest that sometimes, having fewer ideas might be better if they're better ideas.
It's very interesting in this kind of world, cognitive psychology. Fluency is considered to be a really important metric. And it does, in lots of simplistic tests of the kind that cognitive psychologists do. I'm not a cognitive psychologist, so I'm happy to make these statements. You get uninteresting results. There's a lot more that can be said, right? Just a lot more. The one thing I would point you to is the results with these 157 people designing, motivated by the things that motivate them in their world, showed, and again, that's one experiment. You got to be very careful. Most experiments are not reproducible, right? Although we have access to another 150 odd people like this a year later, so maybe we'll see what happens. But coming back, the number of ideas produced by the GPT exceeded by one order the number of ideas produced by the human designer. But the human designer's ideas were always considered better. Let me come back to fluency. No designer has as their guiding principle fluency. The guiding principle is, what is the first idea that I'm going to work with? If it's the absolute first idea they come up with, that's all they do. And if it takes 10 ideas, it takes 10. And if it takes more, it takes more. When we study practitioners, you don't see them producing many ideas. The mean number is 6. There's plenty of people who say, first idea. Of course, we call that fixation. But I published a nice paper that says you can't tell the difference between commitment and fixation. We don't have the tools to do that. People are early committers. All our AI models are not. All our AI models are extend as much as you can. Nobody does that because they don't have the resources to do it.
No.
We need to end because we have our next speaker coming in. But thank you so much, Professor Giro, and people will have a chance for questions during the panel at the end. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, John. That was brilliant. And I want to welcome the third speaker now. Thank you all. If you have questions for Professor Giro, please do keep them for the panel discussion. John, if you can stop sharing your screen, then I think David should be able to share his. Perfect. Thank you, David. So you want to try and share your screen, David, and then I'll start introducing you to see if that works.
Okay, let's just
Perfect.
see if everything's
Yep.
working. That looks like it's good, and you can hear me okay, Anna?
Yes, that's great. Okay,
Perfect.
so I'd like to introduce David again. David, just like John, is chiming in all the way from Australia. It's super early there. We're very thrilled that you're making the effort to do this. Thank you so much. So Professor Cropley is a professor of engineering innovation at the School of Electrical and Mechanical Engineering in Adelaide University in Australia. He has numerous publications to his name, including over 10 books on topics such as engineering, creativity and crime, organizational creativity and innovation. He's written extensively now about generative AI, specifically in relation to creativity. A couple of examples is the article "The Cat Sat on the what question mark the why generative AI has limited creativity," which came out in the Journal of Creative Behavior, and that explores what the upper limits are of LM output creativity. Another one is a book chapter, Creative Products and Artificial Intelligence, that is coming out in the book Creations, which is sort of a critical evaluation of AI's capabilities in terms of strengths and limitations. And another book chapter is The Paradox of Creativity in the Age of Generative AI, which has just come out either this year or last year, late last year, Generative AI and Creativity, where essentially explores how AI could broaden the scope of what we think human creativity is. His talk title, as you can see there, is Generative AI Creativity, Adequate, Anodyne, and Artless. Thank you so much, David, for being here.
Thanks very much, Anna, and thank you everybody. If I keep rubbing my eyes and so on, it's just after 4 in the morning, and I don't think I've been up this early for a while. But the problem is always that you can satisfy any two of the three groups around the world, namely sort of North America, South America, Europe and Africa and the Middle East, or Asia and Oceania, but you can't satisfy all three at the same time. So I miss out today. On the other hand, I've got a nice early start to the day, so I'm later on by 9 o'clock in the morning here, I'm going to be sort of full of energy. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I also bring greetings from my father, Arthur Cropley, who many of you know from his research. Arthur is still, I go and have a coffee with him several mornings a week. Arthur turned 90 last December, but he's still active, and he still keeps threatening to me that he's going to write a new paper about something. So we still have a lot of conversations about creativity. And of course, he also met Paul Torrance several times way back in the day, probably in the 1960s. So he's also kind of an interesting historical figure in creativity to talk to. So thanks for the introduction. I'll get straight into it. So I'm talking about generative AI and creativity. In the subtitle here, Adequate, Anodyne, and Artless, gives you a clue as to where I'm heading with this talk. And what I want to do is basically prove to you, I think, why large language models are not very creative, and talk a bit about why that matters, for example, for things like human AI co-creation. And to give you a little bit of background to that, I'm sure you all know the basic argument about how artificial intelligence is changing the nature of work. And I mean there artificial intelligence, not just generative AI, but other forms of artificial intelligence. And alongside automation and other forms of software and robotics, this has been the case for arguably decades. Robots have been welding cars and painting cars in factories for 40 years and displacing humans from certain kinds of jobs. But the argument for a long time has been that if you work in a job that's physically and intellectually predictable and algorithmic, then your job may be under threat. But if you work in jobs involving creativity, that's the premise here has always been that this is the area that's uniquely human, and automation, in a general sense, won't take our jobs. However, enter generative AI or large language models in late 2022, and suddenly this idea that humans do creativity, computers do the other stuff is under threat. And a lot of people have been asking the question, is generative AI going to take our jobs in things like creative writing, art, music, and also, of course, I would argue in engineering, where the essence of engineering is design. Design is about solving problems, and a lot of the time we need to find new solutions to problems that have never occurred before. So engineering also has a strong element of creativity. So we're all concerned about this, but I think I have good news for you, and that is that I don't think generative AI is really going to threaten our human creativity. But we're in a state of flux right now, and I hope to show you why that's the case, and also equip you with some of the ammunition that you need to make this argument to other people, to ensure that people don't mistakenly replace humans with generative AI in creative roles, and then only to discover that they don't get a very good result. Anna mentioned the paper that this is largely based on. This is just the sort of top half page. So this was published in October last year in the Journal of Creative Behavior. If you don't have access to that for any reason, unfortunately it wasn't open access, let me know and I'm happy to share this with you. So moving on, and of course we'll have time for questions at the end. So since ChatGPT appeared in late 2022, there have very quickly developed two poles in this debate about creativity in AI. And research started appearing very quickly, claiming that AI is creative, or that it's more creative than humans. At the same time, research also started to appear debunking those claims, and I've produced a little bit of research of that type myself. So whether you regard the AI as creative as hype, and the other sort of research as the skeptics, whether you think AI is more creative than humans, or that AI is simply a stochastic parrot, we need an answer. We need to resolve this situation kind of once and for all, so that we can, if you like, get to the truth and move forward with the necessary knowledge that we have. Now, the approach I've taken is that there are many different lenses through which we can study creativity, and I'm talking, of course, about the 4 Ps. So creativity, on the one hand, involves personality, but I would argue that AI is not subject to motivation or things like optimism, so person or personality is irrelevant to this discussion. Creativity also involves environmental factors, the so-called press, but AI doesn't care if it's a hostile work environment, it doesn't care if its boss is a you-know-what, so press is irrelevant as well. And while creativity involves divergent thinking, we'd probably label this the process, that process aspect of creativity, in my opinion, in the case of large language models, process is just a means to an end. It's how we humans arrive at a creative product. It's not necessarily entirely relevant for a large language model. So I think we can park process to one side as well. And that leaves us with the 4th P, which is product. So my argument, based or supporting all of this, is that if we want to understand the truth about large language model creativity, there's just one lens that we need to look through, and that's the lens of the product. In other words, the result of creativity. And in fact, some scholars, for example, Donald McKinnon, have been advocating for this since the 1970s, and quite a lot of my own work over the years has been to do with the nature of products and how we define them and so on. Now, fortunately, we now have a pretty clear consensus on the standard definition of creativity as published by Mark Runco and Garrett Jaeger in 2012. And of course, what they did is bring together some of the threads of how we define creativity and sort of put a clear label on that. But that gives us a framework with which we can study this question of creativity in large language models. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So I believe we can say that the best and most universal way to understand creativity is to consider the product. And remember that the product can be an idea, it can be a physical artifact, it can be a story, a painting, anything that represents the outcome of a creative process. The standard definition also tells us that there are just 2 factors that we need to consider, And yes, there have been other versions that include 3 or 4 things. Some of my own research, again, has looked at this, but it boils down to 2 essential factors, and you can see these on the screen. The creativity of a product is a combination of the effectiveness of that product, in other words, its fitness for purpose or its appropriateness, and it's a combination of the novelty of the product, that's whether it's original or surprising or perhaps unique. And not only is it a combination, but it's a very specific kind of combination. It's a mathematical product of those 2 things, so effectiveness times novelty. And just a little side note here that connects us back to the torrance theme here is that for a long time, it appeared that the first person to actually define creativity as the mathematical product of these 2 things was Dean Simonton in 2012. But only really in the last month, I discovered a monograph by a person called Jerome Moss, who was working at the University of Minnesota in the 1960s. And he published a monograph in 1966 that buried within that is an explicit statement that creativity is effectiveness multiplied by novelty. And the reason that's interesting, not only is that we've had that definition for a long time, but Jerome Moss, I think, may have been supervised by Paul Torrance. He based this monograph was based on the Minnesota tests of creative thinking, which Paul Torrance devised, but also in the preface to this monograph, he actually thanks Paul Torrance for his moral support and counsel. So there's a nice little connection back to Paul Torrance, even with this definition. So creativity is effectiveness times novelty. And the important thing about that is this is true whoever or whatever does the creativity. So it's an ideal way to examine the creativity of a large language model. It gives us a level playing field. So I'm going to go down this little path and explain or use that to show you how we can understand large language model creativity relative to humans. So the first thing to do on this slide here is to understand what this combination of novelty and effectiveness looks like for humans. And in the paper that I mentioned, and here I've got a graph that compares effectiveness and novelty. So on the horizontal axis, I've got effectiveness, and I've measured it, if you like, between 0, so no effectiveness, and 1, meaning maximum effectiveness, and the same for novelty, 0 and 1. And if creativity is the product of those 2 things, then clearly creativity on this graph ranges from 0 in the bottom left corner up to 1, maximum creativity, so 1 times 1, 1 in the top right. Now, that's a pretty straightforward thing, but this graph helps us to understand the relationship of those 2 factors and actually reveals some interesting things about creativity. The first, for example, which has been identified by other writers, is that if either effectiveness or novelty is 0, then creativity collapses, because anything times 0 is 0. So if E is 0, doesn't matter what N is, creativity is 0. And well, that's kind of, arithmetically obvious. It does sort of start to make us think about some important things. For example, it just highlights the fact that creativity requires at least some effectiveness and some novelty. In other words, in particular, it sort of shows us that creativity is not just novelty on its own. There are some other consequences of this as well. For example, if you look at the colored contours on here, then what those represent is a single value of creativity. So that comes from any particular variations of E and N that result in a single value of creativity. And what that really reveals is that there's more than one way to achieve a particular level of creativity. So, for example, the orange-yellow curve there is a very low level, 0.0625, but we can achieve that level of creativity by having very high effectiveness and very low novelty, or conversely, very high novelty, very low effectiveness, or a balance of the 2. So it allows us, if you like, to play to our strengths. So if we feel, for example, an engineer might say, well, I'm pretty good at actually implementing things, so my strength is effectiveness, maybe I'm not so novel, you can still achieve a certain level of creativity. However, following on from that, it also shows us that the more creative the product becomes, in other words, as you move to the top right corner, that flexibility becomes more constrained. So as you get to very high levels of creativity, in fact, you don't have the same trade-off that a product has to be simultaneously very high and very novel to achieve the highest levels of creativity. So creativity is less forgiving at the high levels. Another sort of conclusion that we can draw from this is we know that at least some humans are capable of those extremely high levels of creativity. And you'll have noticed that I've put the 4Cs labels on this diagram as well. So borrowing from James Kaufman and Ron Beghetto's framework of the 4Cs. And in fact, that allows us to kind of divide this not into 4 quadrants, but into 4 regions. So below that orange curve, we can think of that as mini C creativity. Between the orange and the green curve, little c, then pro C and big C creativity. And as I said, we know that at least some humans historically are capable of big C creativity. So we know what we can do. The big question here is, what can large language models do? So can we place large language models on this graph? If we can, then of course we've basically answered the question of how do large language models compare to humans. One other thing to point out before we do that is that the green curve in the middle of the diagram there, where creativity is equal to 0.25, that's an interesting boundary there, because that's the boundary between little c and pro C creativity. So effectively, that's the boundary between amateur and professional creativity in any given domain. Take creative writing, for example. You could also say it's the boundary between basically below average creativity and above average creativity. So as I said, a kind of a long lead in, but if we can find a way to, if you like, measure the creativity of large language models and then put it on this graph, on the same level playing field, then we've got an answer to the question, is a large language model more or less creative than humans, or where does it sit relative to humans? So let's have a look at that. Now, this comes back to the title of my paper, The Cat Sat on the Blank. Now, I'm going to assume that everybody has a sort of basic understanding of how large language models work. If you don't, I apologize, but I'm going to compress it into about a sort of 30-second description. The essence of what a large language model does, and how we can place the large language model on that previous graph, is that we prompt the large language model with some sort of statement. And let's stick to the simple case of a single word response. So imagine that we prompt the large language model with the input, the cat sat on the blank. In a large language model, it ingests that prompt, it digitizes it, it understands that prompt relative to its training, and it spits out an answer. But what it's doing internally is actually creating a probability score for every possible word that's a response to that prompt. And the probability score is a score that tells us how good a fit any particular word is as a response to that prompt. So for example, the word mat, the cat sat on the mat, mat gets quite a high score, as you can see here, because it's an effective, it's a semantically appropriate response to that prompt based on the training of the model. Other words like lap or rug get a moderately high probability score because they're pretty good responses, but most words would get a very low score, and an increasingly low score the less relevant those words are. So the probability, the token probability as it's called in the large language model, effectively tells us what the effectiveness of a given response is. And you can see what's happening is that we're putting this in the language of the standard definition of creativity. So it gives us a connection. The concept of effectiveness or token probability gives us a connection back to our equation, which opens up the possibility of measuring the creativity of the large language model. And it goes a step further, because it's important to recognize that the more probable a given word, in other words, the more effective it is, the less unusual or surprising, or the less novel, But a very low token probability is the reverse. Low token probabilities effectively tell us how novel the word is. So in the single number of the token probability, we've actually got a proxy for both effectiveness and for novelty, which means we can feed that back into our equation. However, before we do that, there's one other thing we have to recognize that's unique to the large language model. So just to recap, large language models give us a high probability, give words a high probability because the word makes sense as a response to the prompt. In other words, the word is effective. This means that large language models are designed to favor effectiveness. And simultaneously, large language models reject words that have a low probability because those words don't make sense. In other words, they're unusual or odd or surprising or novel. Here's the critical thing. Probabilities, of course, have to add up to 100% or to 1. So in a large language model, a word cannot simultaneously be 100% effective and also 100% novel. The more effective it is, the less novel it has to be, and vice versa. So on the graph here means that what we effectively have is a kind of seesaw or a negative correlation between effectiveness and novelty in a large language model. In other words, there's this trade-off between the two. Now, if that's the case, then mathematically we can rewrite the term for novelty and put that in terms of effectiveness. In other words, what this negative correlation tells us is that novelty is 1 minus effectiveness. And this is because of the probabilities and the mathematical, the arithmetic nature of the probabilities and the way a large language model works. Now, if you're a mathematician, you're probably already one step ahead. Now we've got a way of actually coming up with a number for a large language model creativity based on the standard definition. So we take our standard definition, E times N, we replace novelty with this new term, 1 minus effectiveness. This is unique to the large language model. When we combine those together and do our algebra, we come up with the equation that C is equal to E minus E squared. And I'm referring to this now as the law of large language model creativity. Now, that's basically simple mathematics, but it has now a profound consequence because that new equation, C is equal to E minus E squared, looks quite different. And here you can see it. So the parabola there on the left is a curve of creativity based on all possible values of effectiveness. And as you can see, the maximum value we get for creativity, if we plug in all these values of effectiveness between 0 and 1, is a maximum value of 0.25. And that's still on this scale from 0 to 1. So straight away, it's looking like creativity in a large language model isn't doing too well because on a scale from 0 to 1, 0.25 doesn't seem terribly high. That's a little unfair to the large language model. And the way we can really understand this is to map that back onto our curve of effectiveness by novelty that we looked at before. And you can see there that if we plot that value onto the other graph, then the value of 0.25 is that green curve. And it means that the maximum creativity of the large language model just kisses that green curve right in the center of that graph. The dotted line now effectively represents the ceiling on large language model creativity, and the gray area is all the values below 0.25 that, if you like, are accessible to the large language model. So now it still looks unimpressive, but it's not quite as unimpressive as 0.25 out of 1. But it means that there is a definite mathematical ceiling on the large language model creativity. So what does this mean? What can we conclude from this, and how does this help answer our question? Well, it means quite literally that large language models are mathematically trapped below that green curve. A large language model is mathematically incapable of producing a response that is higher than C is equal to 0.25. And moreover, that green line, as I said before, represents the boundary between amateur and professional level creativity, or if you like, the boundary between below average and above average creativity. So it seems to be suggesting that the best that a large language model can produce, the absolute best, is just touching average if you're lucky. So this is great news for people who are concerned about large language models taking their creativity related jobs, and should be very reassuring for anyone who's pro C or even big C creativity, or works in a particular domain with that sort of professional level of creativity. There's one weakness, you might argue, and that is that so far this is still just a theory. And of course, like any good theory, the real test is, do we have any real world evidence to support this? Does it have any predictive power? How does it actually stand up, when we apply that kind of test to this? Well, I've got an answer for that, as you might have guessed. So there are two questions that we can examine here in terms of the predictive power of this theory and whether or not it actually seems to bear out what we observe in the real world. The first prediction that we can make, going back to my graph of novelty and effectiveness, was nothing to do with large language models, but basically a new prediction that the human average is that boundary between little c and pro C, and that sits at a creativity level of 0.25. So before we even worry about the large language models, can we find any evidence to support that assertion, that the human average actually has a product creativity level of 0.25 as that mean? Now, one important caveat here, I'm talking about creative performance, not creative potential. So we're not merely looking at divergent thinking scores, and especially not scores of things like fluency or flexibility. I'm talking about real world creativity of products. So the best connection for some of our existing tests is to originality, and originality extracted from tasks that actually have a kind of a real world creative performance dimension to them, not just a kind of abstract creative potential or creative thinking aspect to them. And there's, I think, some positive news here as well. I've looked at a number of studies, and where I can extract the data from other studies or some of my own studies. And I'll show you one example. Now, we only have time here, of course, today to look at a limited number of examples. So, I accept that not every study may bear up to this, but I'm trying to paint a picture that there is at least some evidence to back up what I'm presenting to you today. This particular data set that you see on the screen was from a study by a team of Rawlings et al. From last year. And this particular data set came from specifically the measures of originality from an alternate uses test. I've also looked at this, for example, with more holistic tests of creativity, and found a similar pattern. And in this particular test, the maximum score for creativity was 16. My prediction, of course, is that a quarter of 16, so 0.25 of 16 is 4. Therefore, we should see the mean in this sample sitting at around 4. And as you can see on the graph, the actual mean in this particular sample was 4.12. So that's at least a sign that the theory I've been leading you through is not complete nonsense, but has some predictive power, that all these sort of factors are lining up in a way that perhaps we can trust where this is heading. Of course, I'm still in my own work searching, continuing to look for further evidence to back this up. So that's one tick in the box that suggests that this whole construction, has some foundation to it. One other thing you might notice about this that I'll come back to in a minute is I've found a lot of data sets like this of creative performance tend to be positively skewed. In other words, they stack up at the low end and have a very long tail, and that's not surprising either, the way creative performance works. But it also reminds us that in a positively skewed distribution like this, something up to about 2/3 of the sample sit below the mean, and only about 1/3 above the mean. So there's kind of a split in the population here in terms of creative performance that's not just 50-50. And I'll come back to that in a minute. However, the more important question in terms of testing this theory in the real world in relation to the other big prediction, we need some empirical evidence that confirms that the prediction large language models max out at about the human average. So does such evidence exist? Again, there's good news. I've examined so far over a dozen studies where people have collected data on comparing human and large language model performance on creative tasks. So again, this is not divergent thinking scores. This is not large language models can get a high score on the divergent association test or whatever. This is creative performance tasks like creative writing. And the news here is very strong. I've got 3 examples here to quote from. The first one, the Sun et al. Study from 2025. They looked at 5 different large language models and compared those large language models against, let's say, non-professional humans, so just ordinary humans, not a kind of a domain-specific group. They had 13 tasks, including problem solving and creative writing. And just for the creative writing task that I'm showing here, the average percentile rank of the large language models was on the 25th percentile relative to humans, and the 5 scores ranged between something like the 10th percentile and the 40th percentile. And that's not even professional human writers. So not a very impressive result, but backing up my prediction that the large language models can't push past the average human score. The second one I'm showing you here was a study by Bellemare-Pepin et al. This was a preprint in 2024, just published recently, the full paper in 2026. They also looked at 3 large language models and compared those to humans on 3 different writing tasks. And just their sort of qualitative conclusion here was that humans maintain a significant edge in creative tasks over large language models. The third one is, I think, a very important one, because this one by Chakrabarty and his colleagues used professional human authors, and they compared 3 different large language models against professional human writers, and again found no comparison, no contest really. They found a wide chasm between the large language models and the professional human authors. So there seems to be a lot of evidence mounting up. The Sun et al. Paper, incidentally, they also evaluated 8 other studies, every single one of which showed large language model performance at or below the human mean. So there's a limited number of these studies, but it seems that they're all painting the same picture. So that's good news. Now, and I'm pretty confident that there's very strong support for this. I haven't seen a single study yet comparing humans and large language models on these creative performance tasks where the large language models perform better than the average human. But that raises 2 interesting questions. And the first of those is, if this is the case, if it's so obvious and easy to prove, then why do we still keep seeing, for example, magazine articles, LinkedIn posts, and even some research papers that insist that AI is so creative, or it's more creative than humans? This first question, I think the answer is sort of kind of staring us in the face, but makes a lot of sense. And I think it's quite simple. If large language model creativity maxes out at the human average, then the answer to why some people still think it's very creative is because many people, creative performance tasks, perhaps up to 2/3 of people, are themselves below average on creativity. And of course, if you're below average, let's put it politely and say, if you're a mini C or a little c human creative in a particular domain, and you look at a large language model that's just average, then to you, that large language model looks quite capable. Conversely, if you're a pro C or even a big C human creative, again in a particular creative performance domain, you look at a large language model and you think, that's really not very creative at all. It's a little bit like the difference between IQ levels. If you have an IQ of 100, somebody with an IQ of 70 doesn't look particularly intelligent to you. Or conversely, if you have a very low IQ, even somebody with an average IQ may look like a genius to you. So I think this answers the question of why do we have still this debate? And of course, what it means is that everybody's right. That if you're below average creativity, then large language models are rather creative in your eyes. If you're higher creativity, they're not very creative. So both people in this little debate are correct, and it's a matter of the sort of relativity of where you stand relative to where large language models stand. And that brings us into my final point before we take some questions, which is, what does that mean for human AI co-creation? So very interesting, and I think in 2023, 2024, there was a lot of the debate of AI is so creative, it's more creative than humans. That then began to shift, and fairly quickly in 2025, I'd say we more or less stopped seeing at least research papers saying that, as I hope people realized that in some way or other that large language models aren't particularly creative, whether they subscribe to my particular model or not. And then, of course, the debate seemed to shift very quickly to, oh, well, the answer is human AI co-creation. But even that, I'm kind of giving a cautionary note because of this relativity that human AI co-creation is a way forward, but we have to do it very carefully because, again, it depends on your creativity or the creativity of the person using the large language model for co-creation. And that led me to come up with at least these 5 rules for AI human co-creation to kind of capture some of these nuances. So I'll quickly go through these, and then we'll be able to take some questions. So rule 1, I've said that we should augment, not outsource. The idea here is we have to treat the large language model as a potential amplifier, not a guaranteed amplifier, and certainly not as the source of creativity. The large language model can do something for us, but we've got to be careful exactly what that is. Rule 2 is keep the spark human. In other words, do not let the model decide what is a core insight or a bold reframing or a risky departure. That's the job of the human. And if we want creative outputs, genuinely creative outputs, not just a little bit more creative than us, then we've got to keep the spark human. Rule 3, don't confuse more with better. So this is a pretty obvious one, but perhaps we get easily sort of sucked in by this. Just because large language models can spit out a large volume of very plausibly presented seductive ideas does not mean that the creativity ceiling has been shattered. More is not necessarily better, or just because it's convincingly presented doesn't mean that it's better. Rule 4, judge the work, not the workflow. So a little bit like the previous point, ease and speed are not evidence of higher creativity. So just because a large language model can do this fast or makes our job easier doesn't mean that's a measure of higher creativity. The only applicable measure of creativity here is the product high on effectiveness and novelty? If it is, you've got a creative outcome. If it isn't, then you don't. So we've got to clearly understand what creativity is. I know we do, but the point, of course, is that a lot of people still perhaps confuse ease and speed for creativity. And the last one, rule 5, fight convergence on purpose. So what I mean here is that the co-creation workflows have to be designed to guard against being dragged back to mediocre, anodyne, and artless, to go back to my subtitle, because the large language model wants to sort of pull us back to those mediocre outputs that it's capable of generating. And I don't mean that it sort of does it in a kind of deliberate, malicious way, but that's what it can produce. So it's always going to kind of pull the process. It's going to regress the outputs back to this kind of average. And if we want those outputs to be above average, we've got to make sure that the workflow, the way that we implement the large language model in this process, still leaves this room to make sure that the higher human creativity can kind of shine through. Okay, that's about 30 minutes, so we've got a little bit of time. I'll just throw up this last slide here, which is just a notebook LM summary of the talk. So I'll leave that on the screen while we take some questions. That's just the sort of fancy large language model picture drawn to represent my talk. But thank you very much for the opportunity to present this. I hope it was clear. We've now got time for some questions, and then after that, of course, we'll go into the panel discussion.
So many questions in the chat this time. I want to start with something. You have sort of an in-principle argument about the impossibility of getting LLMs to be significantly creative. And it seems like it's because of a alleged trade-off between novelty and effectiveness. But the history of art shows that there isn't really a necessary trade-off between novelty and effectiveness. So you can have maximal novelty and maximum effectiveness. See, for example, Duchamp, the Impressionists. I mean, we could just go on. So I don't really see why you think there's this inherent trade-off.
Well, just to recap, it's only an inherent trade-off in the large language model because that's a mathematical fact that probabilities add up to 100%. I'm not saying that that applies to humans. That's the point. Humans are not constrained by that trade-off. So as you say, Aaron, humans can be 100% effective and 100% novel. And we know we've seen Mozart and Beethoven and Picasso and so on. We know that some humans can do that. So that's just a constraint on the large language model based on the algorithm.
I just don't think you've given us a reason to think that it actually is a constraint on the large language model. I think you're building in a trade-off that isn't inherently there. So.
Okay, but I mean, it's an interesting debate, but my answer would be, but I mean, that probabilities have to add up 100%. So that's an inviolable mathematical law.
Maybe
You can't have something
expand
that's 100% effective and 100% novel in probabilities because that adds up to more than 100%.
Not if they're two separate events. I mean, so we could talk about this, but I just don't see it at all. But
David, could you just stop sharing so people can see you more
Sure.
clearly? And Eliana, I think, had something to add.
Yes, I was just going to add on to the question about
I'll just move my camera a little bit. Sorry.
no worries about the operationalization of novelty and effectiveness. Are there ways to operationalize them even within large language models that are not inherently inverted? And I think also perhaps there are various domains in which that trade-off changes. You were specifically looking at creative writing, if I recall, or did you look at any other domains in?
No, I mean, I looked only at the mathematics of the model, but then the evidence that I was looking at was in particular from creative writing, because that's where most of the studies have compared large language models and human creative performance. But again, I mean, I think it relates a bit to Aaron's point that if you see, so I've often seen and had similar discussions where people say, oh, yes, but here's an example. If you show me an example where, for example, the large language model supposedly has violated this limitation, I'm confident to say that that's because it wasn't just the large language model. There's always the human hand in there, and then because that's the only way you can. So people say, oh, but I did this and it did that, and then you dig in a bit and they say, oh, this involved 27 steps of a large language model output, then they edited it and changed it and they fed that back into the model. That's different. And my argument to that is always that that's not the large language model being creative, that's you being creative with the assistance of the large language model. I'll give an example of, say, creating pictures with large language models. In effect, if you create a lovely picture based on whatever, the only thing that the large language model is really doing there is saving you the trouble of learning how to paint or draw. But every single large language model picture that I've ever seen people produce, it came from a creative prompt and creative stages where the creativity was from the human, and the large language model is just the engine that produces the image at the end. The creativity is not the large language model, it's the human's creativity and the only way you kind of apparently get beyond this sort of average level where the large language model is involved is because there's been multiple stages of large language model, human input and editing back to the large language model. So you only get that back and forth. And to me, then that's fine because that's the human fundamentally being creative, not the large language model.
We should, yeah, we actually do need to shift to the general panel at this point. Correct? Yes.
Yes, I'm going to add everyone in. I need Leanne. Yeah, thank you, Leanne, for starting your video because I can't add you otherwise. Okay. So, Eliana, I think you had some questions, or I don't know, there might be some in the chat window as well, if you want to start it off while I do all the spotlighting properly. Well, what I should do first is to also introduce our panel discussants, which I haven't really done. Unfortunately, Aaron might have to leave. I'm not sure if he's already left, but that the person who's leading the discussion for the Q&A was Aaron Meskin, who is the head of philosophy at UGA. And his primary fields of focus are in the fields of aesthetics and the philosophy of art. And he's published on all sorts of topics like aesthetic testimony, authorship, defining art, emotional responses to fiction, and philosophical questions raised by comics, dance, film, radio, short stories, theater, and video games. Ileana is still here, and I'll be joining her with a panel discussion. She's just completed her graduate degree in artificial intelligence at the University of Georgia. She has a background in cognitive science, design, and art. And across her works, from founding a collaborative art zine to researching how artists perceive creativity, she's really focused on interdisciplinary collaboration, which has been central to her focus. And she sees it as essential to the future of AI research. In her own master's thesis, she investigated how computational creativity frameworks apply to LLMs through typeface design. So she is in a unique position here to lead this panel discussion with me. Okay, so for anyone listening in, please post your questions on the chat window. And I think Desi, you're seeing there's a separate panel discussion happening on Hoover, and she will feed in those questions as well to us. Yeah. Okay.
Sure. Thank you for that. I'll ask a question. All of you have sort of touched on human AI co-creation, and there's sort of a lot of anecdotal evidence that I know from people who've like either through their work had to apply LLMs to whatever task they're working on, engineering, design, etc. There's a question of what are the sort of safeguards around that, and some of you have discussed it briefly in your talks, but I guess if there's anything you would leave us with in terms of managing our own cognitive load and not having the cognitive overwhelm that often happens with outsourcing tasks, maybe several simultaneous tasks to a AI agent, and yeah, let's just start there.
I'll jump in for a second. I haven't really, in any of my work, considered the safeguards. I guess I tend to sort of look at that. That's the next step beyond this, except that maybe I touched on it in the sense that the biggest problem I think there is with large language models is kind of uninformed people making bad decisions based on their misunderstanding of the creative capacity of large language models. I gave a talk in Canada a couple of months ago and said, was talking to an arts foundation, and there was a couple of, government ministers and so on there. And I said, the big problem is basically stupid CEOs thinking that large language models are creative and making decisions to replace people based on this ill-informed knowledge. So there's kind of a safeguard issue there of how do you stop people making ill-informed decisions about the use of large language models for things like creative tasks. And I don't know what the answer is, except to try and get the message across. These may look and feel creative, but they aren't really. So we need a safeguard to stop people kind of making bad decisions.
Can I add to that? There is a growing movement on AI literacy, which addresses this issue sort of directly. I know a number of institutions, including universities, who are moving towards having, I don't know, a mandatory course, but having a institution-wide course on AI literacy. It's not a lecture, one lecture. It's like people thought you could teach ethics in one lecture, and you can't. It's actually a course that I think addresses a lot of what David has mentioned. You need to have some fundamental understanding. Without that, it's too surface. You're swayed by, Sunday newspaper reporting. And I know there's a number of projects that are being funded to test whether, in fact, AI literacy does what it claims. It'll take a year or two to see what sort of result they produce. But I think a total lack of understanding and being swayed by these claims about what this can do. They can do amazing things. Let's be clear. They can do amazing things. But there's lots of issues they raise of the kind that, 200 years after the Industrial Revolution, we're still struggling with, or 300 years. Right? I have a very different topic, but you have lots of questions. Perhaps go to those first.
Can I just say one more thing about the safeguards? I only like a month ago, my wife and I sat down and started watching the film Havoc with Tom Hardy. And I got about 10 minutes in and thought, this is just weird and awful. Like there's weird expressions on the faces of the actors. There was a car chase at the beginning that looked weird and unnatural. And then we stopped watching. I looked it up and saw, it's being criticized for heavy AI use. And again, it's the safeguard issue here is that if you're a producer in Hollywood, you think, great, I can make a film at half the cost and I'm going to make a bigger profit. And they're making decisions about AI use generally, just and it's not surprising, but they're sucked in by the sort of financial and efficiency aspects. But I don't know if nobody's telling them this is a terrible film, so they're shooting themselves in the foot for the sake of saving a bit of money. And again, I think it's this AI literacy. How do you get the message across that yes, this is faster and cheaper, but it's not better?
I have a different point of view. So I don't think you need to take a course in AI literacy. We each deal with other humans and we don't know exactly what's going on under the hood in the other humans that we deal with. And how we learn is by interacting with them one-on-one. And I think better than taking a course in AI literacy is just to become familiar and to develop a personal relationship with AI through using it for the kinds of tasks that you yourself encounter. And nobody else can tell you how to word a prompt, because as you develop that relationship, you will become acquainted with how the LLM responds to the kinds of problems that you need to solve, which will be a little bit different from the kinds of problems that anybody else needs to solve. And I am aware of several studies that have been carried out in which the LLMs did outperform the humans, and I put a little paragraph from a chapter on computational creativity that I just wrote that talks about a couple of those, but also in my own lab. So, for example, for many years in my psychology of creativity class, a task that I did to explain to them how our memory structure differs from that of a computer would be that I would ask them to invent 2 or 3 words that don't actually mean anything at all, and to come up with definitions of what those words would mean if they did mean something. And it has to feel right to the person. And then what they would do is they would get in with a partner and they would give their words and definitions in some random order. And then they would have to guess which word went with which definition. And inevitably, they would be able to perform very well at that task. And so I got the idea for this from a paper written by Bob French in like way back in 1990 or something, where he had the word flug blogs and he have possible meanings for it. And one of them is some kind of official document that you sign in a legal circumstance. And the other one was shoes that you walk on water with. And of course, everybody guesses that it's shoes that you walk on water with. So that's where I got the idea for this. But then I would show them that like why an AI cannot perform well at this class. And then all of a sudden, right after the pandemic, I found that, oh my gosh, I think now AI has reached the point where I can't do that exercise in my class anymore. And so sure enough, I did give LLMs this task. I had literally used this task for 10 years in my class to show them how our minds differ from that of AI. And LLMs actually did outperform humans at this task, at guessing which words went with which definitions, even though objectively there is no right answer. So it's just based on kind of gut feelings. But because LLMs are very good at detecting patterns and regularities, they can sort of match this, perform very well at this task. Yeah, so there's a bunch of tasks at which they actually have outperformed humans, and I think they will only get better and better. They're just getting started.
Yeah, I agree in that not having experiential like opinions on the performance of all these different models, especially as they improve and new ones come out, it can really like hinder your understanding of like what we're really talking about when we talk about LLM capabilities. So it's cool that you were doing that experiment in the classroom. And yeah, I kind of had to poke around myself the whole time to understand.
Could I just reinforce that? We treat LLMs as some sort of static object, and they're not. In two ways. There's the one that, there's new models coming out and old models being tweaked. But we're also changing in the way in which we use these. We did a quick look at, 1,000 undergraduates. And it turns out the sort of prompts they ask at the beginning of a semester are really quite different to the ones they ask at the end, once they get some experience about how they can elicit different kinds of responses. So the notion that they're static is a problem, which also introduces another problem, sort of connected to what Leanne was saying. When we take something that has a very low probability in David's graph, the fact that we bring two distant words together, for us, changes that. These two words that were very far apart are no longer far apart for us as an individual. And any model that doesn't take account of that means it's not going to follow us. It's static in that sense as well. We constantly change ourselves. And I'm thinking particularly people whose business is to change things. Designers, engineers, composers, writers. So it turns out, like almost all tools, actually not almost, like all tools, they help us and hinder us at the same time. And it's very hard to disentangle how they hinder us.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up, John, because I think that's really a saying that my team gets sick of me saying is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. I always say, which is like when you think about tools, there's a skill enhancing and a skill extending and a skill depleting side to it always. And the question is, what are you willing to go for? Just for the speakers, just so you know, there's active discussion happening on the side. A lot of it is commentary on either agreement or disagreement with what you've said. So please engage with them in the chat window if you wish. I think Sabrina will. I think you raised your hand if I'm not mistaken. So could you just ask your question directly? That'd be great. She's speaking next tomorrow. So Sabrina, it's great to see you here.
Yeah, happy to be here. Yeah, and I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about tomorrow ties in with today, so that's great. But as far as the AI literacy component, I kind of want to understand how you guys are defining AI literacy, because I actually think it's extremely important to and I was part of the initiative at our college to make sure every single one of our undergraduates takes an AI literacy certification. Where I'm coming from with AI literacy is understanding the ethics, how that these machines, what are they fed, understanding the vocabulary, understanding that it hallucinates, understanding how to evaluate output critically, and all of those things. I think it's really important for us to, whether we're co-creating or not. And I think also for us to understand where it might outperform us. And I mean, it'll outperform me all day long in putting a spreadsheet together. I have no doubt about that. Understanding where the capabilities lie and when I'm stronger and I need to defer to myself. I think all of those things come along with AI literacy. And also, I think for the younger generation of our students, most of our students are between 18 and 21. They have been using AI since high school. They're growing up with it. And I think for them to kind of understand the bias of, that authoritative, polished output that they get from AI. Everything AI puts out looks finished. It looks right. And so if they don't know the domain, they kind of take it for granted. And I think AI literacy comes with that knowledge too. So as we talk about AI literacy, I want to know, what are you all referring to exactly, and if we're on the same page.
I'll jump in for a second. I think, from my point of view, it's understanding exactly the sort of thing that I was talking about. And I think part of the challenge there is, it's in relation to creativity. It's hard enough, for example, in engineering, to get people to pay attention to creativity. I don't expect that it'll be any easier to get them to pay attention to discussions about the creativity of generative AI. I've been told by colleagues, you can have as much of that creativity stuff as you like in this degree, as long as you don't take out anything else, because they're terrified of removing any mathematics that's been in the engineering course for the last 150 years. And so a literacy issue, I think, is we've got to make space for things like AI literacy in university programs. And that means giving up something else to make room, because you can't just keep adding another course on top of everything else. So I'd say that there's a fundamental issue in relation to AI literacy, which is, where do you fit it into degree programs and what do you take out?
Well, there's two issues here which you've sort of raised. One is what's in a course, and the second is, how do you get it in a place where they already have too many courses to take. I can tell you, I spent time in a computer science department that was redoing its undergraduate program, and all the senior professors wanted to keep calculus. And the reason why they wanted calculus is because it was in their undergraduate program, not because people use calculus in computer science anymore at all. And we have this problem everywhere. You have to displace.
Yeah.
I always liked Schumpeter, if you know the economist Schumpeter, in in the design world, he's famous for just one idea, which only took a few paragraphs, called creative destruction, which is the notion that you introduce something and that something destroys a whole realm, a whole space of ideas because they no longer apply, right? And the question is AI doing this? Is AI a form of creative destruction that's getting rid of things, or is it just complementing? Now, what's in an AI course, I mean, there's debate about that. Just as there's debate about what computer literacy means, right? You know, everyone in the 21st century, everyone should be computer literate, but what does that mean? And I don't know we've settled completely on what AI literacy means, but at least we expect an understanding of the fundamentals. I mean, we don't expect people to learn about machine learning and transformers in any way except what they are. But without that fundamental understanding, I think the sorts of things that people accept without question is going to be rampant because it looks so good.
Yeah.
And it's not the first time we've had a technology that looks good. When computer-aided design was introduced, people thought, replace sketching with this computer-generated stuff. The computer-generated stuff looked fantastic, right? I mean, it looked finished. And people thought that it was finished, and therefore it had an authority that sketching on pieces of paper didn't have, when in fact it was the opposite, the exact opposite. I think we're going to see that repeated. Every generation has to make its own mistakes.
It reminds me of a joke that I heard many years ago about somebody in a restaurant, and then they have their meal and it's terrible, and they start complaining to the waiter and shouting and say, "I want to see the chef." And then the chef comes out, and the chef is 6'6" and 250 pounds, and says, "Yes, what's the problem?" And the person says, "This meal that you cooked for me is terrible." And they see the chef and say, "But it's delightfully cooked." And I think that's the problem with the large language models, is they produce delightfully cooked
Yes.
garbage a lot of the time, and the seductive element of the way it's presented can, for a lot of people, just overrides any sense of whether the output is good or bad, right or wrong. And that's the most dangerous thing about the large language models is this how delightfully it cooks the results. I like to think also, I'm just thinking the other day, like I'm seeing a lot of large language models more and more as sort of Dunning-Kruger machines, that they help unconsciously incompetent people to be even more unconsciously incompetent. And so any issues of literacy and safeguards have to take that into account.
Mm-hmm.
There was a question for Leanne about the Plato's Cave allegory. So the question is, if archetypes, as in Plato's Cave, could that be one result? And if possible, would each new actual, in fact, change all of the possibilities?
Can you say that again?
This is really a direct transcription, but maybe if you could just explain more how you made that connection to Plato's Cave and how it connected to the system that you were investigating in that paper.
Oh, okay.
May I say something? Since I was trying to write a complex question in 3 parts, and it ended up where they got mixed up. And first of all, I was fascinated by by the quantum mechanical aspect of what you're doing, Leon. And so then, as you were talking about things evolving, I was wondering about what some people call the actuals and the possibles in terms of different wave solutions. and where by changing certain certain choices or possibilities, we also change that larger superstructure for the future. And there are discussions about whether we just do that ourselves or we do it as a community or as a cosmos or whatever. But I wondered if you could say more about the quantum mechanical part of what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's just a mathematics, and it's just in the same sense that complexity theory was first applied to objects and physical objects, and then it was realized, oh my gosh, well, you see these same kinds of principles happening in heart fibrillation patterns and in water patterns and so on and so forth. And so they realized that that same mathematics could be useful in other domains. So it's only in that sort of sense that different kinds of mathematics capture deep kinds of principles, and those deep kinds of principles are often not specific to one domain. And it isn't the exact mathematics. It had to be generalized before it was moved over and applied to cognition. But what you see in psychology is that you see a lot of these same deep principles that motivated first in one domain applying in the second domain. So for example, when you're not thinking about something, actually, let me start with in quantum mechanics, there is this well-known phenomenon wherein I'm hearing an echo of myself.
I'm just gonna mute. I think Ruth's thing is playing.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Wherein if you want to know something about something, so to know something about it, you have to do a measurement of it. But any measurement will distort that thing that you want to know about. So that's called the observer effect. And same happens with concepts. So if you're not thinking about a concept, such as say the concept giraffe, you're probably not thinking about that now. But and in that state, when you weren't thinking about it, it had the potential to be a chocolate giraffe. So it had the potential to have the property edible, or I mean, I guess you could eat a giraffe, but most people don't. Or it could have the potential to be something that you would ride on, so a transport object, or it had lots of potentiality. And what happened when I said the word giraffe is it kind of collapsed to having one meaning, which is this kind of default meaning, and it was influenced, subtly colored by this happened at the Torrance Festival, and so all the contextual aspects of this particular instantiation subtly colored your experience of giraffe in that moment, and so it's in that sense that there's sort of an observer effect for concepts. You can't know anything about a concept except by calling it to mind. And it's called to mind by some context, but that context inevitably colors your experience or influences your experience of the concept. And there's also a kind of entanglement effect for concepts. So entanglement is the phenomenon wherein two things become so inextricably bound to one another that anything you do to this one affects this one, and anything you do to this one affects this one, even if they're on the opposite sides of the universe. And that can happen with concepts as well. So, you've got lips and you've got stick, and then you put them together as lipstick, and you just think of it as one thing in your mind, and it loses kind of so when we're combining concepts, we can do that. They show some of the same mathematical signature of an entangled system that you see with quantum particles. And so we're not saying that anything at the quantum level of reality affects the mind. So there are people who make claims like that, and people who say that you can't understand consciousness without looking at that there's quantum effects happening in microtubules that are affecting conscious experience. It's not, it has nothing to do with that. It's more just using the mathematics.
Thank you, Anne. Can we just jump to there's 3 more questions that I want to get to, Ruth, and thank you for that. I think Eliana had one to start with. We only have 10 minutes left, so we get to that.
Yes, sure.
It'd be good, thank you.
So one question that I had was about for for Leanne, actually, the increased state of coherence that a creative process results in or like goes through. And you talked about the relationship between the inputs that people get from their world, the world state, as like incoherent. But I do think that the sort of increasingly there's a sort of like redundancy or like the way that algorithms and social media feed us or feeds in general feed us content and input like really decreases the amount of incoherence like with our own internal worldview and what we consume. And I was kind of curious to hear how you think that affects creative processes and also if a similar pattern happens via like chatbot mediated creativity, co-creativity.
Oh, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you that it would be increasing coherence, but it's also increasing the degree to which our our world models are different from those of other people's world models. So we're becoming so we're becoming more differentiated from one another, and that might be expected to increase our creativity, but make it more difficult for us to meaningfully communicate with one another. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I guess some people argue that it homogenizes as well, but it might be like a further discussion or something else to think about.
Yeah, yeah.
And then also for John, in the end of your presentation, you kind of discussed that this potential decrease in cognitive load could really like raise a ceiling for designers and what they're able to accomplish. And so I was curious to hear more about what that vision of the future looks like and like in practice as well, as a designer working with designers, what that means.
Well, it's a claim that hasn't been tested, right? So that's the first point.
Yeah.
Although
Speculation
elsewhere,
is great.
yes, yeah, predicting the future is hard. On the basis that we have some capacity limit to our cognition, the famous 1957 paper by George Miller, The Magic Number 7 plus or minus 2, showing that short-term memory is limited. And we've done some work to show that visual memory is limited. So clearly, there are some capacity limits. The basis of this is if we take away the consumption of some of that capacity, it's left to do other things. The question is, what do we do? Do we go to the beach, which I think is an excellent idea as long as you cover up so you don't get skin cancer, very Australian thing to worry about. Or do you put it to another purpose? And it's a social question, not a scientific question as to what happens. But it's part of the education, pedagogical view of the world that I think has to change. I mean, I'm certainly old enough to remember I learned to use the slide rule. You don't even know what a slide rule is, right? It was, David does, I hope. It's a mechanical method for multiplying big numbers together without a calculator. An amazing thing invented by Napier. When calculators came in, there was this huge debate as to whether university students should be allowed to use calculators. Right? And when computers came in, we had exactly the same debate. Should we allow students to, because it reduces their understanding. And we have the same debate now. Well, the debate is over. You can't stop people using AI. The question is, how are you going to benefit the educational process? So coming back, I see a lot of benefit in using these large language models if you understand their limitations. And because it releases cognitive capacity. and we expect more. I mean, I always thought, because I believed everything around me, that standards were dropping. You know, we all know standards are dropping everywhere, right? Well, I don't know. I had to clean out some files of mine, and I discovered my tenure application from, I've got to say, 60 years ago. I can't believe I got tenure, because I don't think I would get tenure today, right? Standards are not dropping. It's our expectations keep on changing and how they get fulfilled. So I have, the world is always, it's either going to go one way or another, and you don't know, because it's a consequence of small acts. And every so often it's a consequence of big acts, which we call policy. Universities, I know, are struggling. I mean, I'm affiliated with a number of universities, and they're all struggling with the same question, but coming up with different approaches to it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think the answer to your question is it's going to release capacity, and hopefully we'll do something interesting with it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. I think, Desi, I can't quite locate you here. You have a question?
Oh, yes, I'm here. Thanks, Anna. Yes, David, it's lovely to get to see you in real time present. And I had a question about the impact of time on some of these understandings of output, in that, when we're talking about the variable of time and like the human temporal experience on creative output, it seems so markedly different than a machine experience of time, which might not even exist, and if it does, must be completely different, since they don't have to wrangle with their own mortality. So I was curious how you might perceive, sort of how that might even impact what you were saying about human creativity versus machine creativity.
It's a good question. I have to sort of think about that for probably longer than we've got left. But maybe I think you're right that there's also a time element to this, and it relates to some of the things we talked about earlier. That none of these things are generally sort of one-shot processes. So what I was describing to you was sort of the simplest case. Maybe it comes back to the real answer of how to get value out of these large language models in relation to creativity is some sort of collaborative element. We've already talked about that, and of course, as soon as you look at a collaborative process, you're introducing time. So there's nothing wrong with. It goes back to the point that Eliana made, and we were talking about that. There's nothing wrong with going back and forth with a large language model and that resulting in creativity, and that evolves over time. Like I'm not against large language models. I don't believe that they're capable of creativity, but I do believe that we're capable of being creative with them, as long as we kind of do that wisely and follow a process. Maybe there's a time element. I mean, everybody keeps saying, just wait 6 months, and you'll see. I've been waiting 6 lots of 6 months, and people keep saying they're increasing exponentially. If large language models were increasing exponentially over the last 6 years, the world would have already been consumed by an AI superintelligence, and it hasn't. So they're not increasing exponentially. They're tending to sort of tail off. But I mean, a lot of that doesn't really matter. We've got this tool that has some sort of capability. The real answer is working out how to use it to greatest effect. And we already do that with other tools. We use hammers, cars, pencils, knives, and forks. We don't all of those things. We have to kind of work out a way of using those effectively. So I know I'm
Yeah.
rambling on a bit, but I mean, there's still lots of questions to be answered here, and the whole time dimension in terms of the process. How do these things unfold? How do we go back and forth and so on? There's definitely an important element of time and the process that needs to be understood.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, we might have just a minute left, and I think each of you have talked about really different opinions on a really important, reality in our lives now. And I think each of you sort of alluded to in different ways about the kind of things we're not talking about. I think John talked about motivation. The word surprise came up at least in David and John's talks. And I think I'm sort of interested if you have any sort of thoughts about, David, I think you picked on one example of how it's part of a definition. Bowden sees it as an element there. Jerome Bruner thought of creativity as effective surprise, essentially. These words keep coming up in conjunction with each other. And so there's something with dealing with our generative AI specifically in the way that it's available to the general public that enters this emotional space and is now, through some of John's work and a lot of others, showing how it actually affects motivation, what Desi's kind of referring to in terms of the time. And are you excited, I would say, as the last question, about having to factor in other things in here, and not just at the level of the cognitive, at the level of the output, but actually this experiential motivational side of it? Are any of you thinking along those lines yet?
I think motivation, and which is driven by passion, is everything. If you don't have passion, then you got to ask yourself, why do you get up in the morning?
Especially at 3 o'clock, yeah.
Especially at 3 o'clock. And, just to go back for a minute, what are the things that AI literacy might teach you about large language models? They have no motivation, right? Well, that's a sort of serious lack for anything that's going to take over the world, right? Secondly, at the moment, they have almost no situational awareness. Right? And these are fundamental things for us as humans. They have no value system. We are driven by value systems, whether we articulate them or not. And they're static. Okay, we get new generations, but each one is static. Whether we like it or not, we are one-shot learners. You have a single experience, it changes you. Not every experience changes you, but every experience has the potential to change you. We don't see any of these fundamental ideas about humans in these large language models. We see lots of other things until we get those. Not only that, our value systems change. Anyone who's had a child will recognize that the world changes for you. Right? There's just so many things that change your values through what's happened to you. And you can read about it, but until you experience it, you don't fully understand it. I see these as fantastic tools. I think they're magnificent. I think they've got fundamental flaws if you think about them as modeling humans really in any way. But I don't expect them to model humans. I mean, there's plenty of humans around. We're not short of humans, right? What we're short of is something different. And I think that's what these will contribute. Without wishing to be cynical, this is not the first time AI looked to take over the world, right? 30 or 40 years ago, we had things called knowledge-based systems, expert systems, the claims were surprisingly similar, right? The big difference was they were actually hard to use, but you didn't have this interface that just disappeared because it's natural language. And the results were also hard to interpret. Today's results come to you with this beautiful, smooth, it's like a presentation, and therefore it feels highly curated, and and therefore it gives you this feeling that it's an authority, and it's none of those things, right? The interface is what you're evaluating, not what's behind it. And we meet people like this, people who are extremely persuasive, right? Hopefully in good things, but we know the world is full of people who are extremely persuasive doing bad things. I won't mention any names, but we're all familiar with at least one in the world. So I think anthropomorphizing, as people are doing, leads to a failure of understanding. But that doesn't diminish what they're capable of doing. Let me stop there.
There have been instances of one-shot learning in AI, by the way.
Oh yeah, AI, but not in large language models.
But I think that they're not creative, but for a very different reason, actually. I think they're not creative because there's no self, and because they're not changed by the creative experience. So I think of creativity as something that restructures your internal model of the world, and that's the reason that creativity can be therapeutic, is because you change in the process, and they're not that, because they don't have selfhood, because there isn't this core autocatalytic structure at the core that is self-mending and that has selfhood.
These are sort of related topics in that learning can also be self-learning, learning about your own experience and actualizing and everything. And I'm very grateful that you all joined this conference today and were able to share your ideas with us and your really important work that is going to shape the future of just how we interact with this tool that's clearly changing everything in many ways. So thank you for being here. And if anybody in the audience has more questions, please email our wonderful speakers. And yeah, I think we'll wrap up the session here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thanks
all
very
so
much.
Thank you.
much.
Nice to talk to you all.
Thank you.
Been lots of fun.
Yeah.
An important word in the world today.
Absolutely. Thank you.